And with this important introductory message from Ukraine, I would like to welcome on stage Lisa Shimko, a director of the NATO Association of Canada and chief administrator and jury chair of the Peterson Literary Fund, to introduce our keynote speaker, Diane Francis.
Thank you, Bogdana. As a director of the NATO Association of Canada, it's indeed a pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who I've had the privilege to work with over the past few years in my role as chair of the Peterson Literary Fund. Ladies and gentlemen, if you believe that real journalism is the compass that guides society towards truth and justice, you will understand why the accomplishments of our keynote speaker are so impactful and relevant to today's conference. At a time when our information space is increasingly being contaminated by a toxic mix of half-truths, conspiracies, and disinformation, often pushed by foreign actors such as Russia and China in order to weaken or undermine our Euro-Atlantic alliance, it is authoritative authors and journalists like our speaker who perform an indispensable task and role as guarantors of our democratic values and our national security. With well over 200,000 followers on X, American-born Canadian journalist Diane Francis is one of the most insightful and prolific writers on foreign affairs, economics, and global security. Whether you're watching her in-depth analysis on Britain's Times Radio and other European media, or catching her appearances on TVO, Zoomer TV, or reading her syndicated columns in Canada's Post Media, or the New York Post, Huffington Post, or Kiev Post, you will appreciate her brilliant, no-nonsense analysis of world affairs as she tackles everything from future trends in technology to geopolitics, US-Canada relations, energy policy, the dangers of oligarchy, and of course, Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine. And if I may say, if you're not subscribing to Diane's extremely popular newsletter on Substack, you are missing out on essential razor-sharp analysis to feed the mind. Our keynote speaker's impressive biography and many titles include editor-at-large for the National Post newspaper, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, specializing in Eurasia, distinguished professor at Ryerson University's Ted Rogers School of Management, faculty member with Singularity University in Mountain View, California, visiting fellow at Harvard University's Shorenstein Center, media fellow at the World Economic Forum, columnist at the Financial Post, board member at the Hudson Institute Kleptocracy Initiative, and the Canada-US Law Institute Case University. And to top that off, she is the author of 10 outstanding books. It's no wonder Columbia University has called her the most geopolitically and geoeconomically savvy journalist in the Western world. And we are truly privileged to have her as our keynote speaker today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and a fearless pursuer of truth, Diane Francis.
Wow, thank you. I didn't know I was all that. I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes and sort of explain a little bit of my interaction with Ukraine and how I came to be a champion of the country, and a little bit about what's going forward, what's going to happen going forward. I'd like to say that we are clearly closer to the end than to the beginning of this war. And I have every hope that Ukraine will remain intact and take its place as one of the most dynamic economies in Europe. My first brush with Ukraine was the fault of a Ukrainian friend of mine, Bob Onishuk, who many of you might know. He's a Toronto lawyer. And when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1990, dissolved in 1990-91, Bob said, you've got to go to Ukraine, because my newspaper sent me with a photographer for 20 weeks to go all over the Soviet Union as it fell apart to explain to Canadian readers what was going to be the result. And so I went for a week to Ukraine, and that was it. I was stuck. I was the first journalist, Western journalist, to interview President Kravchuk, who was the first president of an independent Ukraine, a lovely gentleman. And after that interview, and Bob was the translator, we said to each other, oh my God. I said, Bob, he's lovely. I think he's okay. But it's an orphan. It knows nothing about capitalism. It knows nothing about democracy. We've got to do something to help. So Bob and I chartered the Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce that spring in 1991. We remained semi-active, and we sponsored trade missions back and forth and watched it as it struggled with capitalism and with democracy. And it's been a struggle ever since 1991. And so in about 1995, Bob and I were partners in a newspaper in Kyiv, a financial newspaper, which was one day simply stolen by Ukrainian oligarch thugs with their baseball bats, took our paper away, scared our editor into leaving and fleeing the country with his family. And I said, that's it. They got to get their act together. I'm not interested. It's just another rotten, corrupt country. But then the Orange Revolution happened. And then I said, wow, this is the biggest protest and the biggest, most powerful, influential civil society in the whole of the former Soviet Union. Belarusians couldn't do this. The Russians themselves couldn't do this. This was remarkable, and we all watched it on TV. It was amazing. So I went there, and that was it. I was hooked again. And the Ukrainians were able, by sheer dint of collaboration and civil pride, to overturn a rotten election that was won by Yanukovych. Unfortunately, we know that happened. He got back in again thanks to Russian money and the help of a friend of Donald Trump's, Paul Manafort, who gave him a do-over and helped him win the presidency again. And once he did that, he was fully a puppet of Putin's, dismantled the military in Ukraine, which was one of the finest in the world, and sold off weaponry that had been purchased for its military for personal profit to third world dictators. And he actually disarmed the country in preparation for Russia taking it over again. It was clearly the plan. And all of this went on, and it was extremely dangerous, and then fell into a slump again, the corruption and the problems. And we saw it firsthand in the chamber, because people would go over there and invest in Ukraine and have their heads handed to them on a platter because of crooked judges or whatever's. So it was a struggle, and it was continuing to be a struggle, but there was still that civil society, that pride that Ukrainians have, which is very unique. And we had the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, which drove the dictator out, led to the first invasion by Putin. But a rise in nationalism and pride and reform, and finally, eventually led to anti-corruption efforts. And in 2019, Ukraine had its first real free election. And Zelensky won it by a landslide. Thank God. Whatever you think of him, this man is heroic. And so, during this whole period, there were people in Ukraine who were trying to get people interested in Ukraine joining NATO. And the polls people didn't like it. They weren't interested in it. They thought it would have been, and it would have been, even more of a motivation for Russia to be brutal. But by 2020, the polls in Ukraine firmly supported joining NATO. And then in 2022, the second invasion happened, not coincidentally. And now we have this war, which has, of course, gone on since the first invasion in 2014. NATO is a hot button to Putin. And yes, Ukraine should be in, but I consider it a de facto member of NATO already, and that's fine. And NATO does everything it can in the limitations it has to help its members individually, some more than others, to help Ukraine fend off the Russians to the extent they have, which is quite amazing. And that's all on the Ukrainians, of course, but NATO has been there. So I think the focus in the talks has to be on a ceasefire and then on a major security force, which is, in a sense, a de facto NATO, without NATO, which is the big red flag to Putin. It will not be in the deal. And to push for that means an extenuation of a war of attrition that is burning up the youth and the resources and the goodwill that Ukraine has worldwide and internally. So I think that it's important that a security coalition of the willing, if you want to call it, the Europeans consider that pejorative because that was George Bush's term in terms of invading Kuwait, but whatever you want to call it, you can't call it NATO, and it can't be really part of under NATO. It can be helped by all the NATO allies individually. And now, of course, that the talks, and Trump is losing patience, and he should, the talks are faltering on, off, and not going to lead to everything we all hope for. Europe is stepping up. They're next. They know it. And I think that a major Rubicon River has been crossed because Germany gets it. Germany, think of this, has troops in the Baltics as of this week. Germany's leader has pledged defense spending equivalent to $500 billion, and they can afford more if they want to. So we have the fourth richest economy on the planet, technologically capable, but now politically aligned with what we were all hoping would happen earlier. And so to me, Germany's new leader, and the fact that the houses, the parliament in Germany fully back this, that turnaround is enormous. Germany's talking about an atom bomb. They're not fooling around. They get it. They were the problem. But that is an important security step in favor of Ukraine's existence, such as it is now. And I think that that also means endorsement by the European Union and membership of Ukraine. And the French and the British are putting together a coalition of the willing, and all of that has to happen because there will be no rebuilding of Ukraine if it still has a target on its back. And you have to have boots on the ground and all kinds of other things there. The other thing that's interesting is that as Europe realizes it's next, and Germany steps up, Ukraine will be the military-industrial complex of Europe. So will the United States, indirectly. Europe will buy stuff from the US, which will keep Mr. Trump at bay and happy. And they have a ready-made, incredibly technologically advanced Ukrainian military defense construct. The Germans will plug into that, the French and the British and all of Europe. And so the strengthening of Europe with Ukraine at the point of the spear is going to stop Putin, in my opinion. Thank God, and maybe even, God willing, crush his economy and push him back someday. So the other thing that's needed, of course, too, because of my interaction with Ukraine in the past, is that the war has not eliminated all the bad elements in the Ukrainian world. And this is why the next thing that has to happen, which is going to happen, is the European Union membership, which will allow the rebuilding of all of the institutional architecture of Ukraine. The minerals deal with the United States, while painful, has kept Trump engaged. Had to happen, has to happen, and if it's executed properly, will of course provide jobs and economic development inside Ukraine and export income and so on. But you can't have these things happen unless you have the Europeans come in, as they did in Hungary and Poland, and get rid of the rotten judiciary, the incompetent civil service, the corruption, and replace the oligarchs as the structure of the economy. They have to be replaced. I would actually nationalize all of their assets because they collaborated with the Russians, in my opinion. That includes the ones that are running around saying they love Ukraine and are trying to help it, who shall remain nameless. So the economic building will take place because Ukrainians are smart, they have great work ethic, they have resources, and they have drive and resilience. The European Union will provide, as they did with Hungary and Poland, decent institutional structures so that people feel good about investing there, building business there, employing people there. Get rid of the oligarchs so there's not this terrible concentration of power that the Russians were captive to the Russians again. Privatize the state-owned enterprises, which are incompetent but are sitting on incredible wealth creation potential. Privatize them fairly, publicly, openly, and put in place antitrust laws so that you don't have just one or two players gobbling up everything. And keep the oligarchs out. And then you're going to have economic rebuilding. It'll explode. You've got the piggy bank in Germany and in the United States and the rest of Europe. Asia's salivating to get back in there. But if there's decent rules, so what? Let them come in, is my attitude. And the country will be rebuilt, demined. The assets, and that's another thing I like about the new Chancellor of Germany, he wants to take those frozen assets, the heck with the arguments, this is not a good idea, and give them to Ukraine. So where are we now in Ukraine? This is why I'm optimistic. Ukraine has the biggest and best military in Europe. It is bigger than the French and British armed forces combined. It is a technological center of excellence, not just for military stuff, for everything. It was before the war, long before the war, the European country with the highest literacy rates. These are smart people. And the other thing that a lot of people never realize is that the Silicon Valley of the Soviet Union was in Ukraine, it was not in Russia. All the brains that put Gagarin into space, developed weaponry, developed technological advances for the Russian Empire were made and done and invented by Ukrainians. So this is going to be an incredible country once it's out from under the boot of Russia and collaborating with Europe. So it's the best military, technological center of excellence. It has incredible natural resources. It now has allies, lots of very important, prominent, important allies, well-heeled, and its people and its diaspora are second to none. So Ukraine's going to make it. Thank you.
Diane, it's always an outstanding honor to be able to listen to you wherever you are. To have you at our event means a great deal. We've got a little gift for you, but thank you. You'll be in our hearts and minds for the rest of the day. I'm sure we'll be referring to a lot of what you've just mentioned, and thank you for all of the work that you've done on all our behalfs. Just give me a second.